today's event will be very interesting. We have 4 or 5 very well-established professionals who all have personal experience working with or against activists, and should have provide some wonderful insights. I just wanted to point out, just to begin with, in 2023, almost 24%, more than 24% of companies on the Russell 3000 disclosed that shareholder activism was a risk, and they added it to their risk factors, up 21% since 2022, which just shows what the perceived threat out there. And as well, most demands are actually settled long before they reach a vote. Many end up in very expensive proxy fights. So this panel, we will be looking into the steps, tactics, and technical challenges created by proxy fights, as told by corporate executives who have recently faced activist demands, and professionals who advise them. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to each of our panelists to introduce themselves. Maybe start with Paul.
Hello, I'm Paul Fredenzi. I'm general counsel for Curtiss-Wright Corporation. I've been the general counsel for about 10 years now. I've been with Curtiss-Wright for 25 years. We've gone through 2 activists in our stock with approaches. So each time it's been a little different, and I think that's what you'll hear today. But been here for 25 years and have enjoyed every minute of it. So,
Gabrielle.
Hi, I'm Gabby Wolf. I'm a director at Innisfree M&A Incorporated. We're a proxy solicitation and shareholder engagement firm. Innisfree assists issuers and also sometimes shareholder dissidents by identifying their shareholder base, developing outreach strategies, and shareholder communications, and assisting in proxy logistics and actual vote mechanics. Happy to be here today.
Thank you. Ruben?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ruben Zeramian. I'm an attorney and a partner at Sidley Austin. I focus all of my attention on shareholder activism defense and corporate governance. Prior to joining Sidley, I worked for activist hedge funds, and so I bring, I think, a unique perspective in my defense of public companies.
Great. Adele?
Hi, I'm Adele Hogan. I'm a partner and head of securities at Outerberg. And I'm very active in M&A.
And Tony?
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Tony Lynn, Command Financial. We're a leading financial printer in this space for proxy fights for over 35 years. And as Paul said, I enjoy every minute of it.
Right. And just a little me. I am the head of the shareholder activist editing at Diligent Market Intelligence. Earlier in my career, I used to work for an activist hedge fund called Steel Partners, and we did activist campaigns in the United States, in Korea, and Japan. And I spent many years in Asia as a financial journalist. So with that, we will jump into the questions. And feel free to, I believe you can submit questions that can be answered by our panelists afterwards. But first of all, let's start with Paul. Now, Paul, Curtiss-Wright, as you mentioned, has faced a couple of proxy situations. Can you fill us in on that? What were the first clues that you had that there was an activist looking at your company and preparing to target it?
Right. So on the first occasion, we had Starboard come in and into our stock, and they accumulated a pretty sizable position in our stock, which sort of tipped us off that they were going to be approaching us. And it was during the time of a new CEO turnover. So we had a new CEO come in, and we were a little bit, I would say, a little bit down on our earnings. So, performance started some rumblings within our shareholder base. And I think Starboard approached us, accumulated roughly close to 10% of our stock, and then, sent us a letter basically asking us to meet. The second one was with Saddle Point, who didn't accumulate any stock. They accumulated less than 1% of our stock. We didn't even know that they were interested in engaging with us. They sent us a letter, and they sent a cordial email to our investor relations person, and then started to try to have a conversation about getting board seats and and changing our strategy in terms of the way we were our business growth strategy. So, but those were the two different methods of how we became aware. Two ends of the spectrum, really.
That's interesting. What was your first reaction to when you became aware of them? Did you hold a board meeting, or how did you respond, and what was your steps did you take?
Right. So we didn't immediately hold a board meeting. We have a lead independent director on our board. So when Starboard came in, we did notify the lead independent director that Starboard had come in, had approached us. They had approached us more on strategy than on seats. They didn't want any seats. They wanted us to change our business strategy in terms of getting out of what they said was a non-core business. And to be honest, it aligned with what the current CEO, the new CEO, had already envisioned. So when we had that conversation with them after engaging with them and sitting down, we actually, our strategies sort of aligned. And after that, they stopped their proxy battle with us, so to speak. They didn't ask for, like I said, they didn't ask for any seats. They held on to the shares for approximately 2.5 to 3 years to see how we were going to proceed. And over the course of the first 1.5 years, we moved and executed on the strategy, and it appeased them, so to speak. I mean, they didn't take any other actions. They really didn't engage after that. And then they disengaged from our stock, I would say, at about 2.5 years afterward, realizing a pretty sizable gain, on our stock. So everybody was happy when that occurred. With Saddle Point, I would say that Saddle Point never engaged in terms of accumulating stock. They never put their own money into our stock, and they were asking for board seats and for divestitures in areas of our core business, which we basically indicated that we were not interested in. We remained cordial. We asked them in. We had a conversation. We advised the board through the independent directors, through the independent lead director. We did have a meeting on the Saddle Point presentation because they wanted to meet with our lead independent director as well. So we made a phone call to the lead independent director. She flew in. They met with our lead independent director, our CEO, and our chairman at the time. And, we once again basically told Saddle Point we weren't interested in their strategy of divesting certain businesses. And then they put up a nomination for 2 seats, which, obviously we provided, our board with a notice on this. But, after notifying the board, I mean, we engaged our outside advisors right away. We engaged our team. We have a playbook in place that basically as soon as we get an inkling that there's an activist that's contrary to where we believe we need to go with the business, and it won't bring shareholder value, we engaged our advisors, and we received input from our financial advisor, our legal input. We actually used Innisfree for our solicitor and our stock profile, and we used a communications firm an outside communications firm to help us with communicating not only to point, but also to do public communications as well. And if you look back with our back and forth with Saddle Point was rather public, so you can see the public responses and everything that we have done. It's all out there. So, but that was our first call was to our lead independent directors, and then our second calls were to our advisors, our external advisors.
Well, that's very interesting. And you settled with Saddle Point eventually, I believe.
Actually, we didn't have to settle at all. Saddle Point withdrew their nomination.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Those two very interesting cases with two very interesting activist funds. But maybe we could jump to Gabrielle at Innisfree as you're an advisor. In this case, you had a company that was facing activists at different times. But recently, or especially recently, like at Disney, for example, we've seen multiple activists targeting the same company, not working together, but separately. And I think we're seeing more of that. So what's it like running multiple campaigns during the season? How do you deal, as a proxy solicitor, how do you deal with that kind of madness in the back and forth? Because as you point out, these campaigns, there's a lot of communications and a lot of flowing current. So how do you approach things like that?
Thank you. Good question. It's a lot of fun, actually. I find it really interesting and exciting. It keeps me on my toes. It's also very time consuming, as you might imagine. One of the really helpful things I think about working at a firm that works on so many of these high profile proxy contests is we learn things throughout the season. Institutional investors in particular, the way they're implementing new voting positions, new voting policies, when they're voting. So for example, there was a couple of years ago where one of the big 3 index funds was voting the morning of every meeting. And the first couple times that it happened, I was kind of a little nervous when the night before the meeting came, and I was like, I still don't see them in this vote count. But after a few times, I was able to advise my clients, look, we're going to see this investor the morning of the meeting, so don't expect it beforehand. You also see whether institutional investors are taking lots of meetings that season, whether they're not taking a lot of meetings, what issues they're focusing on in meetings, right? We talk to our clients after they have meetings with these institutional investors and hear what kind of issues are being brought up. And this is relevant whether there's a proxy contest or not a proxy contest, because when an investor is focused on a few particular topics, that's going to be relevant for your client to have a good response to, for them to prepare well for when they have conversations with these investors and inevitably ask them for their support in the vote.
Interesting. Now you work for both issuers and investors.
Yes.
Do you find, is there a notable difference between the way the issuer approaches a proxy contest or the investor does?
Yes, there is. Well, I could be cynical and tell you that issuers are willing to spend a lot more money generally on proxy contests because it's not their money, it's the shareholders' money. And activist funds are generally much more reticent to spend money because they have to explain to their LPs why they're spending all this money. That said, you know, activists often don't have a investment banker because they act as their own investment banker. Issuers often do have an investment banker who helps put together slides and comparing the company to its peers, figuring out what its peers should be, thinking about, you know, strategic alternatives to the extent that that plays a role in the proxy contest. Personally, as a relatively young woman, sometimes it is refreshing working with an activist because, not that I do it that often, but because they're very open to listening to people who are, you know, relatively young and women. So it's sometimes very refreshingly nice. The other thing that I think is the biggest difference is that issuers, there's a whole bureaucracy that you're working with, right? You have a bunch of advisors, and I think Paul mentioned this, there's usually a financial PR firm, an investment bank, proxy solicitation firm, and of course, legal counsel. And they're all working together. So there's advisor calls, they come to a consensus view, they present it to the management team kind of considers it, thinks about how they want to present it to the board. And then there's a lot of steps before the advisors ultimately present their view to the board or what they propose, you know, the next argument should be in the proxy contest, et cetera, what the next campaign strategy should be. And of course, not full boards are not always involved in these decisions. Sometimes there's board committees, as Ruben, I'm sure, can tell us more about. But so there's a lot of steps that go on with an issuer. With an activist, it's really, there's one principle, maybe one or two principles, so they can make and change their decisions on a dime. It's much easier for them to pivot during a contest if something's not working. And in issuer, it's a much bigger moving ship, so it's harder to pivot quickly.
That's very interesting. Ruben, maybe you have some thoughts on that. You know, when you get retained by on an activist campaign, what are typical mistakes that management has made before you're retained, that when you go in there, you need to sort of get addressed before you really feel like you're ready to enter these campaigns? And maybe fill us in on that.
Certainly. So I've been doing this for a very, very long time. And I think in the 8 or 9 years that I've been representing public companies, there have been two themes that have been consistent. Not to say that these are required, but generally speaking, these are typically there. The first is a board or management team who has not taken a company's vulnerabilities seriously. A company can have poor TSR, and it could be, you know, painfully aware of that, and it could be looking to improve operations or reorganizations or any other steps it could take to improve the business. But there's also governance vulnerabilities that companies frequently forget about. And there's two types of these. There's the purely legal vulnerabilities that create openings for investors to come and potentially exploit, or in some cases, companies don't have adequate defenses set up. Usually because their regular corporate counsel just doesn't have the defense experience to be able to spot these issues. And then the second is board vulnerabilities. When you have a board that has aging directors with extremely long tenures, large gaps in skills among the directors individually or collectively, these create opportunities for investors to come in and say, hey, we have these ideas for the company. We'd like you to implement them. And here are our 2 or 3 candidates that we think can do a much better job than your current directors are. And the statistics don't lie. 95% of proxy contests involve board composition changes. And so having a strong board, in addition to strong TSR and good governance, is a great built-in defense mechanism. And then the second issue, so that was all related to vulnerabilities. The second biggest mistake that we see is companies who don't take investor engagement seriously. A lot of companies have investor engagement programs where They will, pencil in appointments in the spring or in the fall. But often they are looking at their largest owners and saying, hey, we should meet with index funds. We should meet with a couple of these active investors, but they're not making their way down the list of investors. And it's not to say that, every investor will have a meaningful contribution in terms of criticisms or feedback or plans for the company, but having a solid investor engagement program will, at the very least, show the company a good cross section of what investors are thinking about the company at any given point.
That's interesting. Now
Sorry,
we had the,
Can I just add on to that? I think that was a really good point. One of the key things I also think in that is having a really good investor relations person, an IRO, someone who's willing to do the really hard job of telling management when investors aren't happy and being honest with management. And I've come across a bunch of companies that, a good IRO will make or break a proxy contest because management and the board have already heard the criticism and been able to act on it, as Ruben was saying. Or, an IRO who's afraid to be honest, right? Sometimes it's very hard giving criticism to your boss, but it's so important.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'll just add to that. It's always obvious when the advisory team comes together and there's a weak IR function at a company, and how that has sort of led, well, not necessarily led, but at least contributed to the current situation.
interesting. Adele, I'm going to move on to you because you represent companies, and the question I have for you, what are the 3 top things that companies can do to avoid a proxy fight in the first place?
Right. Well, I spent a lot of my career working on that. So I'm going to put it into 3 categories. The first one is business strategy, which I'll talk about for a minute. Second is a people focus, which I think we've heard throughout the day. And the third is sort of a governance area. But on the business strategy, I wanted to give you some examples. Disney did a very interesting thing. They were being criticized for 3 very expensive mergers, and they actually disclosed some of the returns that related to those mergers, and I think it was a very effective defense. They also were criticized for not having stronger AI and tech. They had a little bit of a tech and AI committee that had been formed the year before, but they didn't even have a CTO. You can't have these kinds of vulnerabilities in a company like that that's in the media space. So you need to have a board and a CEO suite that's active in that area. On the people side, I thought Disney did a very strategic thing, and they brought in 2 new directors, one of whom was James Gorman, who's obviously leaving as CEO of Morgan Stanley. And knowing him personally, I mean, a super strong, triple credentialed person like that is very effective. They also went to their existing shareholders and sort of flipped them. One of them was another activist group that was much, much smaller, but they got them to come on to the program that they were advancing. And so they cut a deal with them, which I thought was very smart. They also had George Lucas, who's one of the 3, he's the largest, I think, shareholder, even though it's very hard to ascertain that through their information. But anyway, he's a big existing shareholder, and they got him to come out and speak favorably of Iger. So I thought that was very, very interesting. And I think also they did on the people side they had a very good approach on knowing their activist. So for example, in the shareholder meeting, when the activist was given 2 minutes and started to speak and then went off script and over time, it almost kind of helped prove their point. So they were able to manage and control things, and then point out some other things about him, which I don't want to go into, that was very effective. And then finally, on the third strategy, it's governance. It's governance, and that includes shareholder engagement. It's including reaching out all through the shareholder list, not just the top people, as was mentioned. We're, as lawyers, huge advocates of the people side of this and the governance, and making sure that that's in place.
A quick follow-up question on that. You mentioned Disney, and we've talked a lot about preparing and things to do to avoid a fight or to get out of it. Disney in 2023 was also facing threats from Trian, and
Yep.
previously little before they'd done a settlement with Third Point, I believe. But they managed to fend off Trian in 23 because they made they had good earnings, they made some concessions, and Tran went away. But they came back this year. Just given everything that Disney had done, were you surprised? And I'm happy to anyone else wants to jump in on this. Were you surprised that they came back? And
I personally wasn't, because as a law student, I also did MBA classes, and we did Disney back then in my business school classes. I mean, in other words, this is just a company that's in a evolving area, media. There's all kinds of subscriber issues. They're in so many businesses and hotels, and I mean, it's a very complicated company to run. I mean, they say there's synergies across the fields. Obviously, other people see breakup and releasing shareholder value. The other thing to do is try to, which I always try to do, is I try to make people look good. I would definitely make it look like a win to him and to that company, because they did get a lot of additional value. He says it's way in excess of 300 million because the press isn't reporting it correctly, but you know, he did get an economic win. You could put it that way, even if he didn't fully win. But I am hearing from, you know, lots of people call me, as they call everybody here on this call. And I'm hearing some of these older activists are sort of looking for their last swan song, or they're still very active out there looking for a positional cementing of their legacy. So watch out.
that's a good point. And Disney, shouldn't forget, was targeted 20 years ago as well by Roy Disney to get out Michael Eisner. So it has a long track record. Now, Tony, Command Financial, you are involved in the nuts and bolts of getting the material out to the various parties. Can you explain what is the role of, say, the printer in a proxy fight, and how has technology changed? You do.
Hi, thank you, Jason. I'm going to say it's an enormously important decision. You know, it's one of these things. Gabby can tell you, Ruben can tell you, Paul can tell you that you know, if there's a problem, it's a big problem. If if there's no problem, it's a good thing. But I think it's a very important decision. Having worked on that Roy Disney proxy fight, actually, and having worked on the other side of the current Disney situation, to me, the printer, people might not really focus in on that, but it is an immensely important decision, and you want to have a printer that has experience with this type of thing. There's a lot of moving parts that aren't normal to a regular meeting proxy. There are tons of details you have to make sure are done right. There are mailings. It's just an enormous amount of coordination, and you just want to make sure. And I would say that you really want to pick a printer that actually has equipment to do the printing. There's a lot of printers out there that don't print. So you really want to pick a printer that actually has the equipment, and that'll mean a difference of more sets of materials during a campaign. During a 2.5-month campaign, you might get out, let's say, 8 or 9 sets of materials to shareholders, where someone else might only be able to get 6 because they can't turn the stuff around quick enough. So that's a really huge thing in my book. And I think that's really at the crux of it here. So
yeah. There's been I'm getting some feedback. Sorry. Universal Proxy. We've had the introduction of the Universal Proxy card, which allow for basically putting all the candidates, both for the issuer and the activists, on the same card. How is that, Tony? How does that change? Has that changed your business much? And I wouldn't mind getting some other people's thoughts on that, because it's been the big news of the last 18 months or so.
Yeah, I think Ruben and Gabby can really, I just, it's one less card to print. I think it's less confusing. I will say this, having seen both cards of a universal card, like the dissident card and the management card, which is supposed to have the same slate, which it does, look completely different. So, so I just will throw that out there. I think it's made it easier for the activists, frankly, but I'll let Gabby and Ruben address that.
Sure, I can start and then Ruben, please weigh in. We have definitely seen a change in leverage. That the UPC has given activists more leverage, and this has partly because BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, who are often the top holders at many companies, in large and mega cap companies, were more likely to support at least one dissident nominee while still supporting most of the management nominees. Their votes used to on management's card before the UPC, the Universal Proxy card, were outcome determinative often. So we used to see a lot more clean sweep management wins. We are seeing less of those. Again, this is at large and mega cap proxy contests. At smaller cap proxy contests, we are still seeing some clean sweep wins, and I suspect that's because the activists have less well-rounded nominees. It's newer activists, and they just have more to learn. They're not as honed in their campaigns. The other thing and this has been talked about a lot, but the UPC really pits the activist nominees against the management nominees in a head-to-head contest. So each person, you can't really hide behind a slate. Each person and their vulnerabilities are out there. And management teams, the board needs to show why each person is necessary, and helpful to oversee management's execution of the business plan and the business strategy. And even someone who might be considered vulnerable, right? Someone who's older, someone who's over tenured, has been on the board a long time, someone who has, is non-diverse, things like that, doesn't have, operational experience in the company's industry. Companies have to do a better job of really showing shareholders why these people are important additions to the board and why their skill sets are important to have on the board. And really importantly, the first time that institutional investors who are going to vote on these proxy contests are meeting these vulnerable directors should not be in the proxy contest, because the way you build credibility is not, is on a clear day. And not during a proxy contest. So I would say, and I think folks have mentioned this already, but off-season engagement is really important for this reason also. And that off-season engagement should include director participants, especially directors who you think are vulnerable.
Okay. Ruben, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, for sure. Gabby did a perfect job explaining that. Just a couple points that I'll add. The first is that the largest proxy advisory firm, which is Institutional Shareholder Services, ISS for short, puts out its voting recommendations along with Glass Lewis when there's a meeting of shareholders. And ISS has, since the Universal Proxy rules have come into effect, ISS is now recommending ISS's recommendations for a single dissident candidate are up about 20% since the UPC rules came into effect. Okay. So you might be wondering, what does that mean? Why does it matter? Why do we care? It matters because ISS has the single greatest influence over the votes of institutional investors. And if 20%, if it is recommending that investors vote for one dissident candidate 20% of the time greater than it previously did, that means that there are going to be far fewer clean sweeps, and that the intention behind the SEC's Universal Proxy rules are actually being given their true effect, which was to ensure that the competition between the company and the dissident is sort of equalized, and that the playing field has been leveled a bit. So together with the rules framework, ISS's influence is actually giving effect to the intention behind the rules.
Interesting. Adele, do you have any additional thoughts on this issue?
No, I think that these points are excellent. The one thing I will note, though, is that in the Disney case, the dissident or the activist felt that he had met with the three biggest investors, you know, the biggest these big investors that Gabby was talking about, and he had thought that they were going to vote with him. He said he had a very favorable meeting, but ultimately they did not. None of them did. So that was pretty interesting.
It's a hard world out there. I wanted to just jump back to Paul, because you have a unique position that you are at a company that's faced activism twice, and given for all the people who are listening, who corporations and boards and the like, what key takeaways? Any sort of like key takeaways from those two campaigns? They were very different, but any sort of parting advice you would give to other board members or other company?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that you need to do your homework, right? I mean, have a playbook. If you are part of a management team with a publicly traded company, you should have a playbook about what steps you're going to take if and when you get approached. I think it's more of if, or I mean, it's more of a when than an if, because I think activists are getting bolder, and even for a company who, like Curtis Wright, our TSR was in the upper quartile of our peer group. Our performance, we were hitting 17%, margins. We were sort of surprised that Saddle Point was even interested in engaging with us. And it all depends. You're going to get someone who's going to knock on your door and say, hey, we want a board seat, or we want you to divest in this way, or we want you to invest in this particular area. And when you get that, you're going to need to know who you're calling, right? So we've had established relationships. We had an established relationship with Tony. We had an established relationship with Innisfree. We had an established relationship with our outside legal counsel, with our financial advisor, and our PR firm. And it made it easy to respond and be able to get a team of not only our internal team, but our external team up and running, because we had planned for this. We knew it was going to come at some point in time. And generally, I will say, and the panel members can correct me, but we see a lot of this. We've seen it at both CEO turnovers for us. When they think that the CEO is at the vulnerable state, when the CEO is new to the game, and they think that they are vulnerable to being influenced by an external threat to the board or to the strategy that we're putting together. But just be prepared is all I can say. Develop your relationships, develop your advisors, and have sort of a playbook as to, we have a timeline. We know when we're going to call a board meeting, who we're calling, when those board meetings are going to be set within a time frame from initial contact to our public, from when we do our public filings, from when we do a press release regarding, I mean, it's a thorough, detailed timeline from days, in terms of how you go about approaching an activist who comes into your stock. So it's prepared. Be prepared. It's a win. It's definitely a win from my perspective, at least.
Any, getting short on time, any parting shots? Any, Gabrielle, Adele, Ruben, Tony, any following up on that? Any last thoughts?
I mean, I'll say I agree with Paul that you should always, you know, have your advisors close. And having them on speed dial is really helpful, rather than scrambling once you get an interest from an activist. So thanks for the plug, Paul.
Just two things. First of all, I think Gary Guyton had a question, so we'll go back to him. But secondly, as the outside lawyer helping the board, when there is an activist that comes on or the board kind of falls apart a little bit and there's a lot of acrimony, a lot of times you'd spend a fair amount of time coaching people and trying to keep people together and moving forward. And part of that is these basic skills of active listening and having people feel validated and trying to get people on the same page, because otherwise, you know, we've all been in board meetings and things where there's screaming matches and things can get quite out of control, and that's really not in the best interest for shareholders.
Yeah, just one final point that I'll add to that is everyone has made good points, but one differentiator that we see is boards and companies who take activism education seriously prior to an activist showing up or prior to an activist engagement fare a lot better during that engagement. You don't want your directors learning about what activism is. You don't want your CEO, your CFO, your IRO facing activism for the first time when it actually happens. So putting it on the annual calendar on the board agenda, providing providing management training, those are essential to getting people familiar with what activism is. And as Paul said, it's really not a question of if, it's a question of when.
And we have some questions coming in, and I'll open that to whoever has it. For Paul or others, having prepared by lining up investors. Well, could you read that? Hold on.
I don't see the questions. I don't
Oh,
know.
sorry, maybe I missed.
Sorry.
Here, I see it. I can read it if that's helpful.
Thank you.
For Paul and others, having prepared by lining up investment advisors, outside counsel, printers, and others needed for a defense team, do you ever do, quote, tabletop practice drills to rehearse and build cohesiveness within the team of advisors before the activist makes contact?
So within our internal team, yes, we run scenarios. We have, I would say quarterly, as part of our quarterly our quarterly investor call, we will have scenarios that we run through about how activists may view things, about what we're saying and how we would respond and stuff like that. From an external advisor perspective, no, we've never really engaged the externals. We have what we do is we keep them close. I mean, we talk to our law firm all the time. We engage in Innisfree usually every other year when we have something on our proxy, even if it's a standard proxy, so that when you pick up the phone, they're answering, right? I mean, you don't want your external advisors thinking you're only calling them in that sense of an emergency. We actually use our legal firm. We use the printer for the non-emergent issues just to keep them close. I mean, we develop relationships with these people and we know where we're going to go when we're in trouble. And it helps to get a quick response from your external team when you're keeping them close in that regard. So,
if I could just chime in there, Bill, that was actually exactly what I had in mind. These tabletop programs are just critical to getting everyone familiar with what these actually look like once you're in the engagement. And there, at least Sidley, we're more than happy to come into companies and offer tabletop exercises and board trainings and even management trainings at a very low cost, if not, on the house. Yeah.
I'll jump in. Not really a question, but I had the pleasure of going through one of these as a head of IR, and I was just clapping for Gabrielle with what she was saying, but all of you guys nailed it. Really good presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been very good. You've been great. And I think there's a lot of takeaways there. And I'm going to be listening to the recording to some very key points. But thank you so much, everybody. And thank you for joining. And we'll get you next time.